Welcome to another episode of Tack Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. We've got a great show today. We're going to be talking about foreign policy and domestic politics. So we'll start with some Russia-Ukraine developments, including a new report on Vladimir Putin's conditions for ending the war. We'll also talk about recent speeches by President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. They promised to pursue foreign policy realism and restraint. And we'll discuss how well the administration is living up to that aspiration. Finally, we'll talk about the big, beautiful bill. That's Trump's term, of course, for the mammoth budget bill that the House passed last week and that the Senate is considering now. So let's start with the Russia-Ukraine war. So Russia intensified its drone and missile campaign against Ukraine over Memorial Day. As I mentioned, there was a report, it was by Reuters, came out Wednesday. We're recording on Thursday, a little after 2:30. And that report, as I said, laid out Putin's conditions for ending the war in Ukraine. Those conditions include partial sanctions relief, Ukrainian neutrality, protection for Russian speakers, an agreement on the assets Russia has that are frozen in the West, and a written pledge by major Western powers that NATO will stop expanding eastwards. Hours after that report came out, news broke that Moscow had proposed another round of direct ceasefire talks with Kiev to be held in Istanbul next Monday. So these diplomatic developments amounted to some rare, non-depressing Russia-Ukraine news, minus the whole escalated drone and missile campaign, of course. And last week, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had announced that the UK, France, the US, and Germany had lifted range restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range Western-supplied missiles to strike inside Russian territory. So that had raised the risks of escalation for reasons we can discuss now. So, Sumantra, what do you make of these overall developments, including the German announcement last week?
Yeah, so the cry in this town goes that President Trump and his administration they were frustrated with the Russian, differing on Trump's approach. Now, obviously, the counter argument to that is the Russians don't trust the Americans. They find American politics volatile. They kind of think that even after Trump goes away, it's just going to go back to normal. There will be this antagonism, which is just going to be dormant for as long as Trump and maybe J.D. Vance is in power. And then after that, the classic American anti-Russian instinct is going to come back to the forefront. It's a difficult scenario, and we have to understand, keeping ourselves in the Russian shoe. But that being said, on this side of the town, there is this understanding that Trump and his administration were somewhat frustrated with lack of progress on the Russian side, as evident from Trump's regular posts on Truth Social and Twitter. Saying that this is, Vladimir Putin has gone mad, and this is not something good, and this is, he's going to find out, and all that. The more theoretical argument for this is the Trump administration has sort of backed itself in a corner in some ways. We have seen repeated arguments from the administration about the idea that we are a neutral arbiter, we are a referee in this conflict, we are not a party. We are not belligerents, and we can walk away. It's a good faith endeavor to bring both sides to talk to each other. But if that doesn't happen, it doesn't really affect American strategic interests anyway. So we're just going to walk away. We have seen the Vice President, J.D. Vance, mention that quite often. We have seen Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, mention that. And it's kind of implied in Trump's quotes and Truth Socials. That time is now. I think the administration is facing somewhat a paradox of its own making in a way, where it's put our shut up time. Like, it's easy to say, oh, the Russians are being mad, and like if you don't come to a talking table or have a conversation or have some kind of negotiated settlement in the next 2 weeks or 1 month, we are going to walk away. But then when the time comes, like, or else what? Like, you're genuinely walking away? Like, is that beneficial for the United States? How will that optic look like? Are the Russians capable of hegemonic threat or taking over Ukraine? What would the Europeans do without any kind of American security or American control? Is that going to lead to an individual war between a NATO country and Russia, just out of pure escalation? What if, like tomorrow, without America, the Europeans say we're just going to move troops in Western Europe, Western Ukraine, and that creates this kind of a conflict situation where there are two heavily armed troops, face to face in the same vicinity, and wars can start that way. So the administration is not clear as to. I think one of the first things that they could have said is like, clarify their geostrategic interest in this game, and move forward from there on. But I think they haven't done that, and that is creating a problem for them. So the next 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, are going to be extremely important to see if the Russians are starting a summer offensive, which is obviously the Russian prerogative. But if it happens, and if the Russians are, starting a new front in the Ukrainian war, then it's going to be very difficult for the administration to either, just keep talking or not do anything.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense to me. I think we disagree a little bit on the walk away point. I should say I refer to these diplomatic developments this week as non-depressing, but I do get the sense that obviously that Russia is stalling somewhat. Like they have huge advantages in manpower and materiel, so it kind of makes sense that they would be stalling. As far as walk away, when JD Vance and Rubio made those comments about walking away from the peace process, I believe that was in March. It was kind of ambiguous at the time whether walking away from diplomacy would also mean withdrawing military support for Ukraine. And I suspect they kept that ambiguous intentionally, because otherwise, it's not much of a threat against Russia. They have, it would benefit Russia in that case for the U.S. to withdraw, to walk away if that implies that it's also going to withdraw military support. So just to get some clarity before I go to Joseph, Sumantra, when you say walk away, you also are definitely imagining that military assistance to Ukraine would cease, not just diplomatic engagement.
Yeah, when I mean walk away, the concern from the Russian side should be like, without any American influence whatsoever, the chances of an escalation spiral happening in Ukraine is very high. At the end of the day, I think the Russians miscalculate or misunderstand just how much the United States tempers down European belligerents in Ukraine as well. It is very easy for a European country, especially Poland or Germany, to send troops to Western Ukraine purely from or even the British, like send like 200 troops as a trainer in Western Ukraine, and then for some reason a Russian drone or something hits them, and that creates a casus belli for a full scale war. Also, simultaneously, if there is no American influence on the Europeans whatsoever, the Europeans are absolutely free to decimate the Russian reserve currency that is there in European banks. That will be immensely painful for Putin's immediate circle. Um, to answer your question, when it comes to walking away, I do think if Trump actually means what he means by saying that he needs to walk away, he needs to get out of it altogether. Like that includes not even providing any kind of targeting coordinates to the Europeans, which would then be leaked to the Ukrainians. If he's meaning to walk away, it means walking away altogether, not just aid, not just weapons, but like any future, to leave Ukraine to the hand and mercy of God and Russians. I also think that that's extremely difficult to do. I mean, it's one thing to actually say that you would walk away, but again, a lot depends on how the optics of the conflict is. If the Russians are invading in a second front and opening a second front, but they're not being able to do much about it, and they just have like a couple of villages in the next 6 months, that's a whole different game. But if the Russians, on the other hand, make a dash to Kiev and are successful, then that becomes very difficult to swallow for, regardless of how restrained this administration is, it's going to be a really bad optic. And I don't think the president actually is willing to face that situation in front of his domestic electorate. So it's a tricky situation. I mean, I don't envy anyone in the State Department trying to navigate.
Yeah. And I should say the Quincy Institute tomorrow. So tomorrow is Friday at 1:30, I believe. They're hosting a debate between the Quincy Institute's George Beebe and Defense Priorities' Jennifer Kavanaugh on this very question of whether the U.S. should walk away or disengage from these negotiations. Kavanaugh is going to argue yes. Beebe's going to argue no. So that'll be interesting to watch. Joseph, what do you think? Should the U.S. walk away as Sumantra was describing?
I definitely have advocated for just walking away from Ukraine in the past. If the negotiations don't pan out and it doesn't seem like there's any progress being made, it's not very logical for the US to continue to be bound up in the conflict, just slouching towards some indefinite end. But there's definitely a big risk there for the administration, which is if you say, okay, we're going to walk away, this is going nowhere, and then all of a sudden Ukraine collapses, that's going to be extremely bad, both for the prestige internationally of the United States, but also domestically, politically for the Trump administration. That's not the kind of thing that you want to have on your hands, especially, if it happens going into the midterms. Uh, and so it is definitely a gamble. If Trump is obviously going to have much better intelligence about the situation on the ground than we have here, if there's a significant risk of just a complete Ukrainian collapse, that's going to be a much more difficult prospect than if it looks like Ukraine is able to sustain the defense indefinitely and Russia's just going to keep gaining, you know, 6 inches a week of ground in Ukraine across the front lines. Um, so, if the United States says, okay, we're done here, we're getting out, the war continues to grind on for, a year or two more, and then there's some kind of ceasefire because everybody's just exhausted and nothing is happening, then that would probably be a success for the Trump administration. We avoided it, we didn't spend American money, and we didn't risk American involvement in what is ultimately just a complete waste of everyone's time, money, and resources. But again, there's always that risk of collapse, which could be very bad. Although the other question is, if that's the case, like, how much is the U.S. going to be willing to put in to stop it? That's the other side of the question.
Yeah, I'll make a maybe quick case against walking away, but first I want to concede. The main thing that it seems like Ukraine needs right now is missile defense, and we don't have like a lot of Patriot batteries and missiles that we can send them. I know that we refurbished one that was located in Israel and redeployed it to Ukraine. There might be some more, Patriot batteries in Israel that we can do that with, but even so, Russia has this new ballistic missile that is modified specifically to better evade Patriot air defense. So there's no silver bullet here, basically. But to kind of continue Joseph's point, just thinking about Trump's political interests, so not necessarily strategic interests related to the war. Um, Trump knows well that Joe Biden's poll numbers never recovered from the botched Afghanistan withdrawal. I mean, it's kind of amazing. There's evidence that voters don't really care that much about foreign policy, but in some cases, it seems like the average American really does. And that was one. And you can just look at the poll numbers, and it's very clear that it coincided with the withdrawal. I was living overseas when that happened, and I was fairly frequently asked about it. Like, I kind of think that the Hawks are right when they talk about how America's prestige really took a hit. Its credibility took a hit as a result of that. I still think it was a good idea to withdraw, but you get my point that this is politically extremely dicey for Trump, especially since he promised on the campaign trail that he would resolve the war within 24 hours. So if he instead, you know, if we get the grim spectacle of Russia gobbling up a former Soviet bloc after America appears to retreat, Trump is really going to get flailed by the media for that. And I can imagine a lot of people in the conservative political establishment turning against him. And then as far as, strategic stuff, I do think that, you know, the antipathy toward the West among Russian hardliners has really increased throughout the war. And I think that those tensions, the Russian Western tensions, are more likely to ease if this war is resolved not in total Ukrainian military capitulation, but in negotiations that take every party's concerns into account. I don't want Europe to do what you just described, which is to just fully officially steal these Russian assets that they've frozen, because that's like a bargaining chip that they can use. There's even been some indication that the Kremlin would be fine with some of that money going to rebuild Ukraine post-war, although I think that they're imagining actually the territories that they've annexed. But nevertheless, I don't think we should burn that chip. But Sumatra, I'll give before we move on to the next topic, I'll give you a chance to respond to this kind of brief, argument against walking away.
No, I can see that walking away. It's the democratic setup of the current U.S. administration, or just in general, our time doesn't allow for that kind of immoral realism, which would have been possible in 19th century or even like mid 20th century. So it is, and the problem is not who's in power or which country we are talking about. The problem is like we are living in 2025, and there is mass media. You mentioned about the Afghanistan conflict, and it's absolutely right. No one in America wants that conflict to continue, and the problem wasn't even Joe Biden's fault. It was the Pentagon had 2.5 years to plan the withdrawal, but they didn't because they were betting on the idea that Joe Biden is going to stop the Trump withdrawal from Afghanistan. So when Joe Biden came to power and said that no, I'm not going to do that, I'm just going to continue to withdraw. Obviously, there was no time to plan that thing, and it was a so the only people who are actually responsible are the top brass of the Pentagon, but nothing happened to them, and Biden, you're absolutely right, Biden didn't recover from that. Because no one actually likes to see that in public, like people dying, falling from plane, jumping. It was an awful spectacle, and that affected him. And Trump, for what it's worth, he understands the make or break effect of any kind of optic on these kind of things. So walking away is difficult. I mean, the one thing is interesting, like, for Russian analysis, it's always interesting to see what they're doing rather than what they're saying. The fact that the Russians have made some of these conditions for a negotiated peace settlement, which include some of the stuff that we already wanted to give them anyway, which is a signal that the Russians understand that these are easy for the American people and the American administration to accept. So that itself shows that the Russians are kind of like willing to talk more. Like NATO expansion is not going to happen anyway, regardless of I mean, there is a full stop. The American administration, whether it's Trump or Vance after this, is not interested in any kind of NATO expansion. And the Russians have said that, yeah, one of our conditions is no NATO expansion. Well, okay, fine, great, take it. It's something that they already know that we are willing to give them. So those are kind of like latent signals that the Russians are interested in more of a negotiated settlement. So, but again, the next 2-3 weeks is going to be crucial.
Yeah, and I'll say on that, I mentioned we don't have a lot of military sticks to, drive Russia to make a peace deal. But Trump has put on the table this broader rapprochement in economic partnership with Washington. And I know to a virtual certainty that Moscow genuinely wants that to happen. So that's a big carrot. That could, be enticing and kind of
Absolutely.
distract Putin from the scent of total military victory. I do think that Trump needs to make absolutely clear that that's only going to happen if the war is settled, not if Russia overruns Ukraine. Because otherwise the carrot doesn't really work if Russia thinks they might get it anyway. Um, and I think I had another point that I wanted to make that I've now forgotten. So I'll just move on to our next topic, which is these recent speeches over Memorial Day weekend by Trump and Vance on foreign policy realism and restraint. I think Secretary of Defense Hegseth also gave a similar speech, but I didn't have a chance to look into it. Trump, in the commencement address at West Point, decried nation building and woke ideology. I'll read a passage. For at least 2 decades, political leaders from both parties have dragged our military into missions it was never meant to be in. They sent our warriors on nation building crusades to nations that wanted nothing to do with us, led by leaders that didn't have a clue, in distant lands, while abusing our soldiers with absurd ideological experiments here at home. End quote. So that echoed some of the themes and lines we heard during Trump's address in Riyadh earlier this month. Vance, in his own speech, promised that the administration would pursue a strategy grounded in realism and protecting our core national interests. He had some criticisms of forever wars and ideological crusades like Trump did. Obviously, this is music to the ear for people like us, while others, like Ben Shapiro, condemn foreign policy restraint as isolationism. Shapiro is feeling especially aggrieved by reports that Trump told Netanyahu not to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. I want to ask you in a bit about that, Sumantra, but first I'll go to Joseph. You wrote our State of the Union article on the Vance speech. What stood out to you about that Vance speech, and how much do you think these nice sounding speeches reflect the actual Trump administration foreign policy? If you want to comment on that too, Joseph.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of I think the Trump and Vance are obviously laying out a new vision and groundwork for American foreign policy. Vance in his speech explicitly says that the United States should pursue realism, which is quite different from what he calls lofty, often incoherent abstractions. So there's a statement that okay, the United States needs to stop pursuing nation building, values based foreign policy, and move towards what Vance said are clearly stated strategic goals about core national interests. Um, so the most explicit thing that is being done in the speeches is a repudiation of neoconservatism. Trump in Riyadh was extremely harsh and also very explicit, uh, denouncing nation builders, interventionists, and so forth. Um, so the question is, how much is that being translated into policy? And that's a little bit more difficult because it's not only realists who speak in terms of American national interests. Interventionists have also speak in terms about national interests. And so there's a bit of a conflict about what actually is an American national interest. The sort of more idealistic approach towards foreign policy will argue that uh, aiding democratic countries is in the United States' national interest because democratic countries are more likely to have a similar interest to the United States and therefore to be willing to go along with our priorities. Um, and of course, there's also the deep state, which is the entrenched foreign policy establishment, which has a very particular set of views, both about American national interest, but also about all the various ways that the United States conducts itself internationally and the kinds of ways that foreign policy should be done. And those are the people who, even under a Trump administration, overwhelmingly staff the foreign policy organs of the United States. And so it's always going to take a long time, I think, for that to trickle down. You see a little bit of it beginning to come through with things like Trump putting people in the Ben Franklin Fellowship in relatively high positions in foreign policy. Um, but it will take time for that to actually become actualized. You can obviously see it most at the top with Trump's pursuit of talks with various countries as opposed to supporting intervention just as the matter of course. Um, but I think that it's important that it's being laid out, and I think the more that these kinds of speeches come out and the more explicitly this is made, the more it will eventually be able to trickle down into and become actualized. Because what we have is sort of a general vision, and now what needs to be filled out is the actual methods and policies for implementing that vision concretely. I don't think that's been done yet, but I think, for if you're interested in a realist foreign policy for the United States, this is a very good start. And it's kind of where you have to start with, because you don't have people who are already in the State Department who have lots of experience working in American foreign policy usually. There are a few realists here and there that have gone through the State Department or the Department of Defense, but they're by far a minority.
Yeah, I want to get a your views, Sumantra, on the same thing I just asked Joseph about, what you think of these speeches and how well Trump is living up to this aspiration of a realist and pro-restraint foreign policy. And I'd be especially curious to hear your reaction, if you have one, to Ben Shapiro's rant against the so-called isolationists in the White House.
I mean, look, uh, I Ben Shapiro trying to gatekeep what realism and restraint and isolationism is something that Ben Shapiro has been doing since 2015. He tried to oppose Trump and then support Trump and then oppose Trump again, and it's complicated. Clearly, his interests are quite different from what the president has quite explicitly talked about. Like, it was kind of funny that Ben Shapiro was talking about how Trump is an isolationist, and Mark Levine was talking about how Trump, isolationism is bad, but Trump is like, a strong MAGA president. And then Trump was asked in the press conference, like, did you warn Benjamin Netanyahu? And he was like, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. So I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Like, it's the dying, impotent rage of a failed, discredited ideology, which is in its last gasp in influential circles within the right. And clearly the old right is, I never really liked the term new right, because this is the actual old right. So it's pathetic, but that's a whole separate conversation. I have mixed feelings about the whole speeches about realism and restraint. On one hand, it's good. The fact that the president and the vice president are talking about national interest rather than some ideological abstraction is in itself a good thing and a change. We are not fighting for good versus evil under George W. Bush, or democracy versus autocracy under Joe Biden, or supporting freedom throughout the Middle East, according to Barack Obama during the Arab Spring. So that rhetorical change itself reflects a changing country. And this is not just like people's interests, but fundamentally, structurally, American relative power has declined since 2002, and this is a reflection of that. It's a good thing. It's a sign of good, healthy democracy that political leaders are changing their tone given the interests of the country. I think Trump has clear instinct of a peace builder. He has repeatedly talked about commerce first, not chaos. Like, he wants to do trade. He wants to make money. He's a businessman. Like, he doesn't really care about morality in foreign policy. I don't quite know where JD Vance stands on that one, and I'll explain why. So I constantly talk with European diplomats, as some of you know. One of the things that I've constantly heard from Europe is their confusion as to what does the Trump administration even mean when they talk about realism and restraint. What do they mean by civilizational allies? Like, those are things that they are not compatible rhetorically. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. For example, JD Vance talked about Europe needs to take its own burden, and then his Munich Security Conference speech was based on common values and stuff. Same with the State Department direction about civilizational allies. Now, the very cynical realist take of that would be, yes, we fundamentally see the European Union as a trade rival, and we are going to say exactly all the kind of things which would jeopardize. It's going to be carrots and sticks to the component part of the European Union. So when we talk about civilizational ally, we don't really actually mean something, but what we mean is some of the countries which are in our favor, we're going to uplift, put them up, and those countries which are opposed to us, we're going to put them down. So it's kind of like an old school divide and rule. That's the realist take. And if that is the case, then I agree. Fair enough. Like that is, at least in some way, that is a logical, realist expression of foreign policy. My question is, though, whether it is actually that cynical and realist and imperial, or there are some really deep belief in this. I'll sum it up in a simple way. Barry Posen once said that everything starts with strategy in this business. In foreign policy, it starts with strategy, grand strategy. A grand strategy of a country could be defined by either kinship, these people look like us, we're going to defend them. Those people don't look like us, we're not going to defend them. That's a logical. You might agree with the moral and immorality of the statement, but that is a logical expression of interest. It could be a culture and religion, like these people are co-religious to us. These people have similar culture and kinship. We're going to defend them, or we don't. Or it could be geography. Fundamentally, these are the places which are important for us. If we lose these places, the other side will have too much power. We're going to face an invasion. If we don't lose these places and they're in our sphere of influence, we have power and we dominate. It cannot be anything other than these three. These are the three fundamental variables of defining what a foreign policy realism would look like. I am not sure as to where the American realism at this point in time, rhetoric notwithstanding, is going towards. If we genuinely, I mean, that needs to be clarified. If we are opposed, if we want the Europeans to take their own burden, we don't need to interfere in how they rule. It doesn't really matter. Like if Turkey and Saudi Arabia could be our allies, I don't care how the Germans, have their internal dynamic. If Germany is an ally to us, that's fine by me. On the other hand, if we do value about kinship and culture and religion, that defines like as to how far that kinship and culture and religion is going to go. Is that going to stop at the border of the English speaking world? Will that go to Western Europe and France and Germany? Will that cross the Danube and be in Eastern Europe? Will that be in the Baltics, in Armenia? Like, where does that stop? Geographical question then comes in the forefront. I don't think so far, from what I've seen from this administration, that clear line has been defined. And that could be rhetorical, that could be vagueness. Deliberately they're keeping that vague because, like I mentioned, it could be a divide and rule towards the European Union. Again, I understand that logic. I haven't seen anything like that. The confusion from the Europeans is completely understandable because they don't understand what this administration wants. Whether you can have kind of like a good relation with this administration, and they're not going to care about your individual performance or domestic politics. The Europeans are not going to lecture the Americans. The Americans are not going to lecture the Europeans, and they're going to have a good negative equilibrium and share a burden. Fine, but on the other hand, that is not what we are seeing, and that creates a sort of confusion.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all that because I think it's really important. When Vance had that speech at the Munich Security Conference, I wrote an article right afterwards, and I noted that he was using this first person plural. Like he was saying we and ourselves to refer to America and the Europeans. And that speech was really interpreted as like Vance browbeating the Europeans. But if you read it closely, you realize, some people have asked this question of like, why is the Trump administration not criticizing autocratic states like Saudi Arabia, etc.? And yet it's very critical of the domestic politics of European countries. And I think one reason is because they feel like they almost have a right to do that because it's all part of the same Western civilization. So it's almost like part of a kind of self-critique or something close to it. It is unusual. I agree with you that the Trump administration hasn't been very clear on whether its America First agenda can be compatible with this, occasional rhetorical gesture toward a kind of civilizational politics. The relationship to realism is interesting. Obviously, structural realism, sometimes called neorealism, which came basically out of the Cold War and the academic study of international relations, it's probably just straight up incompatible with any kind of civilizational worldview. It takes states as they are. It doesn't really look at the history of how they've developed their sense of a first person plural. It doesn't pay much attention to culture. It just looks at the relative distribution of power in the international system and infers interests on that basis. Um, but then there's before that a kind of more classical realism is what it's called, which does allow some more room for considerations of culture and identity. Samuel
I
Huntington, who wrote the book Clash of Civilizations, he was thought of as being a kind of classical realist, although he didn't. In that book, he didn't say that America and Europe would be in the same civilization, as I recall. So that's something a little different. You wanted to say something, Sumatra?
Yeah, I somewhat disagree. I obviously you are not you're absolutely right on the core questions. The structural realists don't completely negate any kind of cultural or civilizational questions. I think structural realism itself is a very Protestant idea in some ways. Like Morgenthau, for example, mentioned that An individual can say fiat justitia period mundus, but a state has no right to say that. A state cannot decide on the ethics of foreign policy. An individual can. So by definition, if you're an individual, you can go and join a civil war in some country, and no one is going to stop you. But you cannot drag a state. Like that itself is a very Protestant worldview. Um, but the question, which again you alluded to, and I want to know what your opinion on that is, if we do think, forget about the structural and classical division. If we do think that America has an interest in Europe, what defines the boundaries of that civilizational ally? Like that is a question which is not answered. Is it UK? Is it UK, France, and Germany? Is it Germany's border? Is it Hungary and Poland? Is it the Baltics, Lithuanians? I don't know. Like I if that if where is that civilizational line being drawn? And like if is Ukraine on the right side? If is Russia? Like I mean, how does those questions are at? I don't know the answer to the question. Structural realism, on the other hand, is a very simple, idea on these. It has a very logical explanation to that. Look, at the end of the day, all that matters to the United States is Western Europe. Western Europe has got a compatible trade power that if it goes to the side of a rival, whether it's China or Russia, then they would have enormous amount of manpower and trade and production capacity and launching bases for invasion. So we have to defend Western Europe come what may. Part of the reason we would join two world wars, regardless of whether the people want it or not, is because there was this risk of Europe uniting under one hegemon, and that could have been a risk. But if Western Europe is secure, we don't really care about the other people. Now, again, this is not something that I'm advocating for. I want to know where this administration stands. Structural realism, to me, explains some of the things that other strains of realism cannot. And I'm not really sure the administration has a clear answer on that one.
Yeah, I'll just say, Morgenthau, I really consider, yeah, I'll go to you, Joseph, but I'll just say in response, Morgenthau, he is a classical realist. He might be the classical realist that structural realists are most interested in. But when I think of structural realism, I think of like beginning with Kenneth Walt's theory of
Kenneth Waltz,
international
yeah,
politics, like the totally parsimonious, theorizing. I
yeah,
think it's not compatible with this kind of taking culture into account. But obviously, individually, the scholars can do so. Like John
right.
Mearsheimer can talk about cultural considerations. It just isn't really part of his most parsimonious theory. But Joseph, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say that as far as the question of like where civilizations begin and end, I think it's probably an error to try to get too granular or binary with these kinds of things. I think it's better to view it as sort of like having shades. There are some countries that are extremely close to us, and there are other countries that are far away, and that attenuates. But you can have countries that hover sort of in between, like I don't know, like Armenia, for example, or the Baltic states. I think it's obvious that the United States, as a civilization, has less civilizational interest in the Baltics than it does in the UK or Germany. But I also think that it makes sense that we would consider the Baltics to be, in a sense, in their own class. We would consider them to be part of Europe if we're comparing them to like China, for example. So I think it's better to take it into account as sort of a gradient of civilization. And how that is going to manifest is going to depend, on the situation that's being involved, in which the countries are involved, the other players, and, of course, the administration in the United States and the other strategic interests. So.
Yeah, I can see that it's a gradient. It's like a shifting gradient. I mean, this conversation is highly relevant to the Ukraine war because Russia was concerned that the Western world was bringing Ukraine into its orbit, and the Western, Ukraine is a cleft country. It's like the civilizational divide between the Russia world and the West runs through Ukraine, and that's a big part of the problem that led to all the tensions that eventually led to the Ukraine war. It's interesting, Samuel Huntington is sometimes criticized because in his book, Clash of Civilizations, he predicted that Ukraine, despite being a cleft country, would not go to war with Russia. And actually, if you read his reasoning, he basically says he doesn't think that there's going to be a war because the Western leaders wouldn't be so stupid as to try to drag Ukraine into its own orbit. And so this situation can remain stable
He
indefinitely.
was way too optimistic about that.
He was way too optimistic. But at the time, the the typical American and Western military analyst was saying, no, we shouldn't expand NATO eastward. There's a lot of problems there. It's provocative to Russia. We definitely shouldn't go as far as like Ukraine. And so something changed in like the American strategic culture that led to a lot of the problems we see. As interesting as this conversation has become, I think we do have to move on a little bit to domestic politics, um, and especially the big, beautiful budget bill that Trump is urging GOP lawmakers to pass. Since I currently live in Asheville, North Carolina, and not Washington, D.C., I have an excuse for not being super familiar with the behind the scenes politicking and all the procedural minutia relevant to this. But Joseph, you do live in DC as an up and coming young journalist. So really, you should know this stuff like the back of your hand. So, what can you tell us about what's in this bill and what its chances are of becoming law, and what is like the interesting politics around it right now?
Yeah, I'll try to make this kind of brief because we're already pretty late. But so the main thing that the bill does is, of course, it has to fund the government through, uh, and then the real big issue is, first of all, that Trump's 2017 tax cuts, were scheduled to sunset. So the bill renews those tax cuts. And then the other big thing that Trump wanted out of it is more money for border enforcement. There's a significant amount of money that needs to be handed over to ICE and to the Department of Homeland Security in order to do more arrests, do more investigations, do more deportations, hold more people, uh, you know, uh, hold more court appearances for illegal aliens who are going to be deported. To just to give them the sufficient process to make sure that they're actually legal and we're not deporting American citizens and so forth. Um, so those are kind of the two big asks from the Trump administration: renew the 2017 tax cuts, and then add a significantly more money for border enforcement. Um, then there are a lot of other questions that are being involved. Where these are mostly where the fighting is happening. Um, because Republicans have a very thin margin in the House of Representatives, this was what the big deal was in holding things up in the House. Uh, the moderate Republicans wanted to increase SALT deductions, state and local tax deductions. So, if you live in really high tax state like New York and you pay a lot of state taxes, essentially you can get a tax deduction where you'll pay less in federal taxes because you're already paying state taxes. So moderate Republicans from high tax states, blue states, wanted to increase the SALT deduction, which of course means less federal revenue. Uh, the other thing that was an issue were the Doge cuts. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency had gone through the federal government, identified a bunch of programs that they felt were uh, essentially wasteful or potentially, funding essentially political enemies of conservatives. And so they were saying, okay, we should end congressional funding for these programs. And the other thing that was a big deal was the question of essentially attempting to reduce the deficit because, you know, increasing spending on border enforcement, renewing tax cuts, um, reducing federal revenue by increasing state and local tax deductions, those all cost a lot of money. And so there's then the question of how are we going to pay for all of this? And so uh, So the more conservative members, the House Freedom Caucus especially, was not very happy with the kind of cuts and the kind of spending that was being done and the kind of cuts that weren't being done. And so there was demand for significant reduction, and the question was if that would come out of Medicaid or not. So that was those are kind of the basic points of the political fight over the big beautiful budget or the big beautiful bill for the budget. Um, as it turned out, As so often happens in politics, nobody ended up being really happy. Uh, it was a really hard fight just to get the House to begin to pass the bill so that it could move on to reconciliation at all. And Trump had to come in and personally harangue the House members and say, get on board. And he was not particularly nice about it. And so, they kind of worked things out in a way that made nobody happy. They increased somewhat the state and local tax deductions. They did some cuts around the edges of Medicaid in ways that they say will reduce Medicaid fraud and overspending. Really, it's essentially a cut to Medicaid, but attempting to find the least politically sensitive way to get that accomplished simply because uh, entitlement spending is just such an overwhelmingly huge part of the federal budget. If you want to pay for anything, you really have to go after entitlements, but it's just incredibly politically unpopular.
Entitlements or the military, and military spending increases under this bill. And I don't think it was just around the edges of Medicaid. I mean, they're expecting some, I don't know the exact figure, but some fairly substantial cuts. And they're, it's under the guise of like work requirements, but the fact that they think so much is going to be cut clearly implies that a lot of people aren't going to have Medicaid coverage that currently do have it. So that's how they offset some of these costs.
But even so, the bill is projected to increase the deficit significantly. And so that's kind of the big question. The House ended up passing the bill. Most people weren't particularly happy with it, but it's kind of we have to get the budget passed, or this is essentially political suicide. Like, we can't just sit on this. So nobody
Yeah.
was particularly happy, but the budget got through, and now it's going to head to the Senate. And the Senate is not very happy with the way that it increases the deficit. And so there's a significant portion of senators that are going to try to fight this in reconciliation to try to significantly reduce the amount of spending, or in any case, reduce the amount of deficit that is going to be the result of the budget as it's currently written.
Yeah, and also it raises the it raises the debt ceiling. It raises the debt ceiling, which is one reason they're able to access this reconciliation process and they can avoid the filibuster from the Senate. Sumantra, do you have any thoughts on this big beautiful bill?
I think it's like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's not that big. There have been bigger bills. It's definitely not beautiful, and it isn't a bill yet. So, to be fair, I kind of agree with Joseph. I don't think it's a good bill. I think the Senate Republicans should have some spine, and and there needs to be both military and entitlement cuts, but especially in military. I mean, if you are really, if something, no one touches the Pentagon bureaucracy. If you really want to save money, like instead of tinkering around the edges, like you can save a lot of money in cutting down the bureaucracy in the Pentagon, but that's not happening. The bill increases, as you mentioned, military spending. What have been the point of all the cuts? We are cutting all these programs from the Defense Department. We are cutting, like the Pete Hegseth constantly talks about just how lean and mean the military is and going to be, and there's going to be no LGBT doctrine, doctrination. So what happened to those people? Like, there were hundreds and thousands of those people who were embedded in the military. If they were all let go, where is that money going? So I don't think it's a good bill. I think the Senate Republicans should have a spine and fight back on it. But I'm not very optimistic about that either.
Yeah, if these battles drag on until, the midterm campaign begins, I think Republicans are surely aware that this is potentially like politically disastrous. Like they're they're increasing the debt. Rand Paul saying they're exploding the debt. I think they're raising the debt ceiling by like 4 trillion. The deficit is going to increase by like 2 trillion annually. Is that wrong? That sounds like that's got to be wrong. Maybe I misremember that because that's huge. And they're kind of offsetting tax cuts for like corporate tax cuts and tax cuts that you know as I understand, a huge percentage, like 90% of Americans, are going to get a tax cut if the bill passes, or will keep tax cuts that were already in place starting in 2017. But the bulk of that money is going to like corporations and the wealthy just because they pay the most taxes. So you can imagine. I mean, we're already seeing the headlines like it's tax cuts for the rich, and they're cutting Medicaid to pay for it. the Republican Party was like aspiring to be a working class party right now. A lot of people are on Medicaid at some point in their lives or benefit from it and somehow. Um, so it strikes me as being extremely politically dicey. I would expect as they're gonna decide what to cut to make this a little bit more fiscally responsible, the first thing they're gonna do is immigration. Like I hope that's not true because I think that immigration really needs to be funded, and I think a lot of liberals who are criticizing this feature of the bill should rethink that because the reason Trump is pursuing these splashy deportations that are controversial is because he's trying to create this deterrent effect. So immigrants stop coming here illegally. If they had more money for ICE and to build a border wall, et cetera, they could actually go through the process of, having immigrants go through hearings and, having ICE attorneys kind of look at their case and stuff to deport them in a more kind of legal way. Um, Not that I, disagree with all of the moves that Trump has made to try to find a way to do these deportations. But I think that we really need this funding for immigration. It's like woefully underfunded, and it has been for years. But the reason it's been woefully underfunded for years is because the lawmakers just don't really prioritize it, and that. So I don't know. I don't know if those increases to immigration funding are going to actually stick. I think we've come to the end of this episode, so let's go ahead and do our picks of the week. I'm going to pick Eldar Mabadov's Iran's Christian Heritage. I'm picking it just because I didn't know that there was this, long-standing historical community of Armenian Christians in Iran who have a lot of beautiful churches, and they exist in basic harmony with the other ethnic groups of Iran. So I thought that was really interesting. Sumantra, what's your pick of the week?
Yeah, I'm gonna go with James Antle's bringing global conflict home. It kind of ties to the conversations we have been having for the last few episodes. I have a very specific criteria for any kind of Republican citizenship. Like you don't bring your ethnic grievances if you move to a different country. Like you kind of like leave your identity behind. That is supposed to be how this thing works out. That's the Teddy Roosevelt's idea of an American citizen. We have clearly seen the burden of assimilation being dumped on those who are native to this country compared to those who are arriving fresh. And this is not just like Israel Palestine or India Pakistan or Ukraine Russia. Regardless of where you're coming from, you should forget about your past identity, and you should try and assimilate. The burden of assimilation and integration should be on the newcomers. This is a good piece about how immigration kind of skewers that thing, and to be honest, has a cumulative effect on pretty much everything. I mean, there are Somalian frauds that's happening. There are street conflicts. There are military and foreign policy expenses. That is because of pressure groups in the United States. All of these things could be tracked back to immigration problems, and I think this is a pretty good essay on that one.
Joseph.
Sure. Jacob Grandstaff on the 25th wrote a great article on the Harvard institution stoking left wing media bias. Goes through and traces all kinds of efforts by Harvard's Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy to essentially augment the censorship industry and cooperation with the government and other social media corporations to suppress American speech. It's good journalism, so go ahead and take a read for that.
Yeah, we should probably discuss this conflict between the Trump administration and American universities, especially Harvard. Maybe we can do that next week. But as for this week, this brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to thank our listeners on podcast apps for listening to the end and remind them that they can watch this episode on YouTube. So go subscribe to our channel, The American Conservative, on YouTube. And I want to thank you, Sumantra, and you, Joseph, for the very illuminating discussion. See you guys.